So Matt Kerbel's got the easy job. He comes in after it's all over and says, well, this is what happened, and here's what's going to happen. I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen, to be perfectly honest. This has been a crazy election year. So what I thought I'd do today is kind of do a little bit of background. How did we get to where we are? And then we'll talk a little bit about predictions, what is likely to happen, although we're not sure. And then lastly, I got some thoughts, as was just explained, about what could this mean and where might we go down the road. So we got here in a situation of the two least popular presidential candidates in at least recorded history, if not in all history. And so the question is, how did we get into this mess? And generally speaking, when you approach this kind of historical question, you got to pull out the list of the usual suspects, right? And who are the usual suspects? Well, it's either the system, the process and structure, or it's the people involved. So let's just take a quick look at it. Rats. So how do we get here? A lot of it's, I think we should blame the nomination process. This is my own little pet peeve. But we have changed the way we nominate presidential candidates. There's a big change after the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. And that was the last of the smoke-filled rooms conventions. When Hubert Humphrey got the nomination, even though he had entered no primaries and done very little to achieve it. The number of primaries, you can see the big leap, the big jump occurred after that 68 convention. And it also had an effect on the number of delegates who go to the National Convention to do the nominating. And again, you can see right now we're running somewhere between roughly around 70-75% of all the delegates are picked in primaries. So that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem is the primary system encourages, I think, way too many people to throw their hats into the ring. And as a result, you get, as we had in 2008, we had a grand total of 22 candidates, 10 Democrats, 12 Republicans. 2012, we had 8 Republicans. And of course, this year, 17 Republican candidates and 6 Democratic candidates, not even mentioning all the minor candidates. And so you had this kind of crazy system this year where you've got Donald Trump coming sort of out of nowhere, doing extremely well. And on the Democratic side, you got Bernie Sanders sort of coming out of nowhere and doing extremely well, because I think both of them tapped into the same kind of resentment or dissatisfaction in the country. It appears in different ways, but they're both tapping into that sense. So you get the importance of the primaries. What was interesting about this year is you had a jump in the number of people participating in the primaries. You can see the dotted line over there. Generally speaking, historically, you get somewhere between 12, 13, 14, up to 20% participation. This year we got up to 28, and in a couple of states, New Hampshire and Wisconsin, you had half of all the voters in the state participating, which is very, very unusual. The system that we have for nominating is front-loaded. That is to say, the key events occur very early in the year, February or early March. Of course, the convention doesn't happen till late July or August. But this front-loading has an effect as states scramble to be early on in the process. They want to be early on because it gives them more influence, but because it brings a lot of media attention to the state, including a lot of money to the state. And if you're in New Hampshire and Iowa, that can be important. What it means is you got to raise a lot of money to begin with, even before the system begins. And you got to do whatever it takes to get some sort of standing in the polls. And you can see what happened this year, even before we started the primary system, way back in September. Candidates who, by some accounts, would have been competitive. Everybody was talking about Bobby Jindal and Rick Perry. They were out of it way before the process even began. Then you wind up with Iowa and New Hampshire, those first 2 events, which are always the first 2 events. They are absolutely crucial. Since 1972, there have only been 2 nominees, McGovern in 72 and Clinton, both Democrats in 92, who did not win at least Iowa or New Hampshire. You've got to win one of those 2 states. And to win both of them, you've got to be prepared way ahead of time. To do that, you got to be able to raise money way ahead of time. You have to have some standing way ahead of time, all during that invisible 2-year, 3-year-long pre-primary process that tends to commence the day after the presidential election. People are already talking about 2020, who's going to be in position to play. So you've got New Hampshire and Iowa playing an important role, and of course those states are not terribly representative. And yet they almost control the destiny of both parties' nominations. So that's kind of the structural part of the problem. The other part of the problem is personnel. It's people. It's us, voters, people who participate in these primaries. Caucus attenders, certainly in Iowa and some of the earlier states, Nevada, primary voters, South Carolina, New Hampshire, a couple of the other early states, are not representative of their party. They're not way extreme, but they are off to the sides. They are not typical. Iowa Democrats are more liberal. The Iowa Democrats who participate in the caucuses are more liberal than Iowa Democrats or national Democrats. Iowa Republicans who participate in the caucuses are more conservative than the rest of their fellow Republicans in the state, as well as national Republicans. So you got this problem of primaries being crucial, Iowa and New Hampshire being especially crucial, and people who participate in those primaries not being representative of either of their parties nationally. Now they're not way extreme, but they are off to the side, and that's a problem. The other thing that happens in primaries, which sort of flies in the face of logic, is you would think the people who nominate the candidates would be interested above all in nominating a winner, someone who can win, right? It turns out that only about a third of primary and caucus participants say that they are primarily interested in choosing someone who wins. The other 2/3 are primarily interested in choosing someone who agrees with them on the issues. And as the nature of the issues that we deal with in the society have changed, heavily on the social issues, immigration, things like that, you got a problem. Because it's the people who are most passionate about those issues, tend to be on the extreme of those issues, are the ones who vote on the basis of those issues. Right? And then on the Republican side, there's one other issue, and that's structural, and that is the tendency to use winner-take-all primaries. The Democrats have a rule that when you vote in a primary or a caucus, the allocation of delegates that comes out of that is proportional to the support that those candidates had in the primaries and in the caucuses. So it's a proportional rule. Republicans allow states to use a proportional rule, but they also allow them to use a winner-take-all rule. So if you go back to, let's say, 2008, John McCain jumped way ahead of the pack and did extremely well early on because he won in a series of those winner-take-all states. He may have only gotten 33% of the vote, but that gave him all those states' delegates to the national convention. So that's a problem, and we'll talk about that later on. So that's how we got here. Let's take a look at what we think is going to happen. Certainly at the presidential level, it's pretty much accepted that Hillary Clinton's going to win. I don't think I've seen anybody except Donald Trump who denies that, right? The question is, how big is she going to win, and what difference is it going to make? So I just went and found a bunch of predictions. Roll Call does a typical prediction. And as I run through these, just take a look at where the blue and the red is, okay? Because this is important. You see, they say that certainly Ohio and Iowa are up for grabs, which they may or may not be. But you know, the blue states on the coast, the red states in the middle. Larry Sabato, who's one of our premier scholars of the process, he's got a much more nuanced chart. But if you just look at in general, he says 352 to 173 in electoral votes. Real Clear Politics has Clinton winning. But they're very cautious. They say there's still 140 toss-up states. There aren't. Many of those toss-ups are going to go to Clinton. All right. Princeton Consortium, an excellent source, has it 329 to 191. And Polyvote, 347 to 191. So you know, it's pretty much a consensus that Hillary is going to win. What's interesting about this, I think, is that it doesn't, these things are not much different from what we had in the last 3 presidential elections. These are the actual electoral votes in 2008 up on the upper left, 2004 and 2012. And of course you look at that and one thing sort of jumps out at you. They all look sort of alike, and they all look sort of like what everybody's predicting for this election. That there's a certain, static element to presidential elections. There's always a few swing states, right? Not many left this year, but there are always a few swing states. Florida traditionally was one, North Carolina, Virginia perhaps was one, Ohio and Pennsylvania were always kind of swing states, and Nevada as well. Most people think Minnesota this year is kind of, some people are talking about possibly going, maybe Indiana, but I doubt it. What's interesting is Hillary Clinton has been trying to push into traditionally Republican states, Arizona, Texas, places like that. So we've got some changes. This tells us a little bit about competition. And this is one of the things that I think is important to look at. If you just look at the top row, national vote margins. So I've picked out a bunch of elections here. You can see that the national vote margins were pretty darn close. Now, 2008 was an aberration. That was kind of a semi-landslide. But generally, they've been close. They didn't used to be close back here. They got a little bit closer here. And recently, they've been quite close as the country sort of polarizes and divides into 2 groups. That's at the national level. But if you look at the state level, the difference between winners and losers at the states, on average, that difference was about 8% back here. We're up into the close to 20% now, which basically tells us, as you can see in this little chart, these lines, the country is becoming both polarized and states are more or less locked in, right? There are very few battleground states left. In 2012, there was only 4. And of course, during the presidential election, the candidates visit these states and they ignore these states. I think in 2012, during the general election campaign, there were only 12 states that were visited by either of the candidate. 38 states were completely ignored, right? And that can either make it easier on a candidate or harder. It's easier in terms of travel and spending. It can actually be a little easier too with your message. If you have to preach a message about agriculture supports, you say one thing in Iowa, another thing in the Bronx, right? But when New York isn't important to you, you can sort of forget about those folks. There is one interesting thing going to happen, though, possibly going to happen this year, and that's in Utah. There's a third-party candidate, Evan McMullen, who is running neck and neck with the other 2. So it is possible that maybe for the first time since 1964, a third-party candidate will actually win a state. I don't think it's going to happen, but it would be interesting if it did. Because then all sorts of third-party advocates will say, see, it is possible, when in fact it isn't possible. All right, let's take a quick look at the Senate. The Senate now is 54 Democrats and independents leaning who support the Democrats, 46 Republicans. It is 54, 46, right. If you were thinking, if this were an average year, if this were just sort of typical, let's say going back to 1980, and if you looked at only those 4 new presidents, that is to say non-incumbent presidents who won in those four elections, on average you could predict a couple things. First of all, you could predict obviously that senators are going to win re-election. Anybody running wins re-election. You can see it here. It's well over 80%. But on average, only 6 seats changed parties in those years. And the winning presidential candidate picked up no more than 3 Senate seats in those years. So if this were an average year, you're kind of calculating Hillary's going to win. She's going to pick up 3 seats. She's still going to be in a minority. Right? But averages don't apply. Here's the the actual net changes. If you look at this column over here, there's changes, but net party changes, which is what really matters, hasn't been all that much. And I think what's kind of interesting is here you've got a Republican, Bush. Here you got a Republican, Bush 2, and they both lost seats in that election. Right? So it is not automatic that Hillary would pick up Senate seats. You can look at the predictions that people come up with, and they're all pretty much the same. Real Clear Politics is hedging its bet. It said it looks like 47-46 with 7 toss-ups. Princeton says 51-49, and so on and so forth. Democrats are certainly going to pick up Wisconsin and Illinois. That's a given. They could lose Nevada, however, Harry Reid's seat. He's retiring, and it's Joe Heck is trying to pick up that seat. The toss-up states are the ones that you read about, right? Indiana, Pennsylvania, Nevada, North Carolina, New Hampshire, Missouri, maybe Florida, although I think the polls are telling us now Rubio is starting to solidify that. So it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what's going to happen. One thing about the toss-ups, and there's at least 6 toss-up states now, they never split 50-50. They almost always split 2/3, 1/3, at least. So if you just apply that math, 6 toss-up seats, 4 seats go one way, 2 the other way, the 4 seats would likely go Democratic, and that would then produce a 50-50 Senate if it just stayed flat that way. And that's probably the worst that will happen for the Democrats. What is interesting also is if you look past this election to the next one. Next election, there are 33 Senate seats up for election. 25 of them are held by Democrats. Now, that's about the biggest lopsided margin I've ever seen. All right. And when you have that kind of situation, well, 5 of those 25 seats are in states that Romney won last time. So the Republicans are sort of sitting back now saying, well, we're going to lose the Senate maybe, but we're going to get it back in 2 more years. And that's very, very highly likely to happen. Taking a look at the House, you got even a higher reelection rate. You have to be pretty bad to lose a House seat if you're an incumbent. I mean, you got to really screw things up royally, right? They win. And 70% of them win by 60% of the vote or more. Right? So it doesn't necessarily mean they're absolutely safe, but it certainly suggests that. Currently, we got 246 to 186. Of those 246 Republican seats, 215, 14, 16 are rock solid safe. They're not going to change. So all the Republicans have to do to assure control of the House is make sure they get 3 or 4 more of what's left. There's about 40 contested seats, 20, 25 that are close. Could swing either way. The Democrats need to gain 32 seats to control the House. That has happened only 4 times since 1932. And one of them was Franklin Roosevelt in 32. One was Harry Truman in 48. One was Lyndon Johnson in 64. And all 3 of those are kind of unique situations. And then the last one was in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. So it hasn't happened now in, 36 years? And it's probably not going to happen this time. In presidential years, going back to 1980, this is kind of interesting. Presidential years since 1980, the president's party has picked up 9 seats. But since 1980, with no incumbent running, the situation we have this year, we've had a very mixed pattern. We had a gain of 33 seats in 1980, Reagan, 21 seats in 2008, Obama, but then a loss of 3 seats in 2000 and a loss of 2 seats in 2008. Right? So in a situation that we're in now, the historical precedent is really mixed. it is quite possible that the Republicans could lose very, very few seats in the House. So the question is, why will so few seats probably swing to the Democrats? Well, one reason that explains a large presidential victory of seats in the House is that you have a very popular candidate who wins. People rush to the polls, they vote for that candidate, and then they vote down ballot for that same party. This year we don't have a popular candidate. I mean, Hillary Clinton, her negatives are well over 50, Trump's are well over 60. You're not going to see many people rushing to the polls to vote for these two. It's one of the least interested elections ever. We also know, and there's a recent piece of scholarship that documents this, that in every presidential election, there are a number of people, 10%, 8%, something like that, usually independents, almost always well-informed voters, who figure out who's going to win the presidency and automatically vote for the other party in pursuit of this notion of safe, balanced government. We also know that about 30% of people in the country say that having divided government is better than unified government. So this 8 or 10 or 12% of the public that does this kind of balancing voting becomes very important. This year could be very important with low turnout. There's also something else going on that could limit the Democrats this time. There is a structural bias in the House elections in the country. It has a lot to do with the degree to which either Democrats or Republicans are heavily packed into a given district or not. Democratic districts are very Democratic. Republican districts are sort of Republican. They win, but they don't win by huge margins. Democrats win Democratic districts by a lot. So if you look at the national figures, you get some strange results. Last year, 2014, Republicans won 52% of the national vote, but they got 57% of the seats in the House. 2012, Republicans won 48% of the national vote and got 54% of the seats in the House. In 2010, it was 51-56. That's structural. Some people say it's got a lot to do with gerrymandering. It has a lot less to do with that than it does to just simply demographic living patterns. But that makes it harder for the Democrats, increasingly harder for them to capture the House. So prediction-wise, what are we going to do? My own guess, if I had to bet, would be the Democrats will pick up between 8 and 15 seats. Not more for all the reasons I just mentioned, and not less because there's just, with 21 really closely contested seats, you flip a coin, some of them are going to go to the Democratic side. But it's not going to be nearly enough to take control of the House. So you probably will have a Democratic Senate and a Republican House and a Democratic White House. Now, all that assumes normalcy. And of course, this is not a normal election by any stretch, right? It's a crazy year, and one can derive all sorts of crazy predictions from it. One thing that's going to matter is turnout. Now, normally in a presidential election, you get about 60% of the public, the eligible public, voting at the presidential level, about 55% voting at the congressional level. Heavy turnout for the president depends on popularity of the candidates. As I said before, they're not very popular. So, number one, turnout will be lower. But if you look at the gap between that 60% that typically votes at the presidential level and the 55% that vote at the congressional level, there is some degree of difference in the nature of those two groups. When you have a popular president, more of that presidential candidate's party members turn out to vote with enthusiasm and vote down ticket. That's the coattails effect, right? But the coattails effect doesn't always work. She could, well, it depends. In terms of turnout, if turnout is below 60% for the presidential rate, it'll be below that for the House rate. We don't know, at least I haven't seen, any reason to expect that Trump people, Republicans and independents who like Trump, are going to go Republicans who don't like Trump, we don't know that they're going to go and not vote for Trump, but vote down the line. We think they probably will. It's less clear on the Democratic side for a whole bunch of crazy reasons. So if you have lesser turnout in this kind of an election probably favors Republicans at the congressional level. All right? And I suspect you're going to have lesser turnout. And those people who do vote for the congressional races, typically, as I said before, some of them vote the balancing system, some of them do vote straight ticket. There's about 8 to 12% of voters who split their tickets normally between president and Congress. Used to be a lot more, but it's down to that. But still, 8 to 10% can swing a lot. So we've got kind of an interesting situation. You got some Republicans running in the House running away from Trump. You have a few Democrats running away from Hillary, not too many. It kind of reminds me a little bit of 2010 and 2014, when Democratic House candidates were very nervous about the flack over Obamacare. And so a lot of them were distancing themselves from Obama, in effect saying, please, Mr. President, do not come to my district to campaign. Now, there's a lot of Republicans who are saying that now. And then the question is, how will the voters, this 55% of the voters who vote, how will they assess that? Will they be able to make the distinction between Trump and the rest of the Republicans? I think they're going to, but we'll see. All right. Oops, is that? No. So this is just one. Uh-oh, it's off here. It'll come back on. So what's the election going to mean? You know, when all is said and done, what can we think about what's going to happen? Somebody asked me the other day, is there a meaning to this election? And I said yes and no, because it is simply not clear. This could be just another aberration in American politics. We have a lot of these aberrations. They show up every 15 or 20 years. It will pass. Next time around, people will pick better candidates who are more popular, and we'll sort of be back to normal. Or is this a crisis point in American politics, where we are developing a sharp division in the country between those essentially who want more government services, want to be paid attention to more, versus those who are extremely concerned about the growth of government, budget deficits, and so on. That gap has been growing for about 10 or 15 years. And the question is, will this election lock that in and portend a deeper rift in society? What scares me about this election, and you see it on the Trump side, is a bunch of people who are waiting for some magic person to come riding in on a white horse and save us from ourselves. And of course, Trump reinforces that by saying, I'm the only one who can fix the problems. I caused them, I know all about them, I can fix them, right? That scares the daylights out of me, because that reminds me a lot of some very bad historical precedents over in Europe. And when more and more people develop unrealistic expectations about government, and they seem to be doing that, and when government is less and less capable of delivering on those expectations because of budget problems, then we could be in for a disaster. And I think on both sides you see both candidates promising all sorts of programmatic changes that will make life better for us, very few of which have any chance at all of being passed. So that scares me. I'll get back to that in a second. What else can we think about? Well, look at the Senate. Obviously, the Senate confirms judicial appointments and executive appointments, right? There is no way on God's green earth that if the Democrats don't have at least 60 members of the Senate, Hillary Clinton is going to get her judicial nominees for the Supreme Court passed. It's just not going to happen. Now, because of what Harry Reid did in the Senate some years ago to change, and the problem with that, of course, is the filibuster rule, right? You can filibuster, it takes 60 votes to break a filibuster. And so all you need is 40 to keep it going. That's for the Supreme Court. what Harry Reid did a couple years ago, the famous nuclear option that some of you have read about, is through a parliamentary gimmick, he got the Senate to rule that it only takes 51 votes to confirm a lower court judge or an executive appointment. So that will make Hillary Clinton's ability to fill the lower courts a lot easier than it has ever been before. 20 years from now, when some of those appellate court justices are candidates for the Supreme Court, you'll see an effect at the Supreme Court. But as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, I don't think anything is going to happen at all. There are some interesting changes in the Senate that will happen at the committee level because of retirements and perhaps some election losses. Sherrod Brown, for example, who's a very liberal Ohio senator, will probably take over chairing the banking committee, right? And that is going to be a difference because Richard Shelby, who's a very conservative Republican, now chairs that committee. So you could see more movement on banking legislation. You certainly probably will not see any repeal of the Dodd-Frank bill, which has to go through that committee. The Appropriations Committee, the committee that passes out the money, Patty Murray or Patrick Leahy will take over that committee, both of whom are very moderate, sort of moderate at least, people who have a record of dealing with Republicans. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren will play an important game, perhaps in the Budget Committee. The Finance Committee, which is the committee that does tax law, and everybody's talking about tax reform, right? So Ron Wyden will probably take over that committee. He has an extraordinarily good record of working across the aisle with Republicans. So there's possible hope that tax reform might move. A lot will depend on the president. The House is going to be even more interesting. Paul Ryan will lose. He's got this large majority now, 60-seat majority. That'll probably shrink to 45 seats or something like that. That could still be a problem for him because he's got those 45 Freedom Caucus Republicans sitting over there who are the sort of Tea Party extreme, extreme conservatives. He can't get their votes on anything except maybe to close down the government. That's about it, right? That's going to create a problem for him. He's got a big problem now. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as we go down. There's even talk that they might vote against him for re-election to the speakership. And that will create a problem because there's no other obvious candidate. And these Freedom Caucus folks are demanding that Ryan live up to his promises to open up the procedures in the House, which for the last 30 years have been tightly controlled by the leadership. But of course, Ryan says he wants to do that, but if he does it, it means that when bills come to the floor, the Freedom Caucus folks can offer all sorts of amendments, many of which are geared not necessarily to improve legislation, but are geared to forcing the other side into taking embarrassing votes. All right. That's the same thing Harry Reid was very good at avoiding in the Senate when he was running the Senate. The House would send him a bill, and Reid would simply say, I'm not going to vote on it, because no matter what we do, the bill isn't going to pass when it goes back to the House for final adjustment. So we're not going to vote on the bill, because I don't want my people having to take a vote that's going to come back and haunt them at election time. The Senate plays that game a little bit more than the House does, but the House does as well. In terms of broader governance, imagine what it would be like with Hillary Clinton as president, a Democratic Senate, and Republican House. Could she work with Paul Ryan on some issues? Well, they both agree we need tax reform. The trouble is they agree in opposite directions. They both, I think, understand the immigration problem. Her position is a little bit stronger than his, but there's possibility for some room on immigration. And perhaps infrastructure. They both talk about the need for infrastructure changes. So there's a possibility to work together there. Again, the problem there is that Ryan has a hard time getting a majority for any bill in the House, and it's going to be worse. That means, can he move and pick up some Democratic votes? That depends on what Nancy Pelosi says. And there would be very little incentive for Nancy Pelosi to work with Paul Ryan and support a Republican proposal. What Nancy Pelosi will need is some cover from the White House. If the President Clinton, presumably, were to endorse or work with Ryan at that end, that makes it easy for the Democrats in the House to move over. Not all of them are going to move, but you wouldn't need many. You'd probably need 10 or 20 more votes to provide that 218 majority, assuming Ryan has lost the Freedom Party people. The best prediction down the road is more of the same. I think we're stuck fundamentally stuck with gridlock. All these speculations are speculations. I think we're stuck with gridlock, which means that if we want to change policy, more and more it's going to have to be done at the state level, which is where it's been happening. If you look at policy innovation in the last 20 years, a lot more is at the state legislative level than in Washington. Washington seems incapable of moving for all these reasons we talked about, and as a result, I think we can look to the states for more action of various sorts. One of the big questions is, what will this election do to the political party system? Is it going to, can the Republicans, who will take a pounding, probably in the Senate, certainly at the White House, can they reconstruct themselves? At the House level, I doubt it. Simply because in both parties, so many of the seats are safe for the individual there. And it's very hard to knock over a candidate. And typically, if you want to knock over a House candidate, it happens in the primaries, not the general election. Or there's a greater chance to happen in the primaries. And that just tends to move the parties further apart. Because the people who come out of the woods in primaries are further to the left if they're a Democrat and further to the right if they're a Republican. So there just aren't many moderates left anywhere. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture here. This is when the House and you see the House, when the parties divide on bills, when half of them vote against, at least half of them vote against half of the other party, half of the Democrats vote against half of the Republicans or more. When they divide, the degree to which individuals are loyal to the party has gone up. You're talking here 90% of the time, 92% of the time, the typical Democrat or Republican votes with his or her party when there's a party clash. That doesn't give you a lot of room to finagle around. And if you looked at the really, really important bills, you'd be up around 97, 98%. All right, so you got that problem. You've got this problem too. If you go back and look at the Senate or the House back in the 70s, yeah, the Republicans on the right, the Democrats on the left. But in the middle, there was a lot of overlap. There were conservative Democrats, usually from the South. There were liberal Republicans, usually from the Northeast. And there were a lot of them. And you could forge bipartisan bills. Fast forward 20 years, and you can see what happened. This is just before Newt Gingrich and the Republicans took over the House here. So there were a couple of people in the middle. Now fast forward again to just recent Congresses, and there's nobody in the middle. There is currently no Democrat who is more conservative than any Republican, and no Republican who is more liberal than any Democrat. They just don't exist. You can look at the ideological gap. Democrats in the House, again, this is a scale, liberal here, conservative there. Democrats have become slightly more liberal. Southern Democrats, of course, who sort of disappeared, have become more liberal. Republicans have become considerably more conservative. You see it in the House, you see it in the Senate almost identically. Right? Which is one reason why you can't argue that gerrymandering is causing ideological splits, because you can't gerrymander the Senate and the same thing's happening there. That's happening here. All right? But you can see this gap is growing. And that just creates a massive, massive problem. And the reason it's growing is because the American public is growing apart. And congressmen are pretty good representatives of their constituencies. So you can see back here in 94, and again, this sort of picks up this, if we went way back here, you'd have a different picture. But 94, there was, the American public, there was an overlap. That overlap is shrinking as more people become consistently conservative or consistently liberal. So instead of blaming Washington, we ought to blame ourselves, because I think this is where the problem comes. So the question is, what about those Trump supporters who used to be Democrats? And there's tons of them. Right now in Ohio, the steelworkers would be a perfect example. All right? People who've lost their jobs because of globalization, technology, offshoring, whatever it happens to be, and who have rallied to Trump. They've changed the face of the Republican Party, or at least the face of the Republican voters, considerably. 20 years ago, they were dyed-in-the-wool, locked-in, solid liberal Democrats. Now they're supporting Trump. Is that going to continue or not? Will this be what they call a converting election, where a part of the electorate makes a permanent conversion to the other side? That's something we want to watch, and we won't know that until we see the next election or next two elections, because that would certainly redefine the face of the Republican Party from what we know. What about a third party? We don't like Hillary, we don't like Donald. Why don't we have a third party? You hear more talk about that now than we've heard for years. The American public, I think it's about 45% of the public say they would like to see a third party. Could we get one? Well, historically, third parties, of course, have been one issue or kind of extremist parties. Everybody's wish, their desire, is a middle-of-the-road party. Oh, let's get moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans, put them all together. That's not as easy as it looks, because you got two kinds of issues at least to think about. One are economic issues, one are social issues. So would that third party be liberal on economic issues but conservative on social issues? Or would it be conservative on economic issues and liberal on social issues? So maybe we need two centrist parties. But then what about the whole business of isolationism in foreign policy and defense, security? That means you need six, if you actually work it out, you need six centrist parties. Well, that ain't going to happen, obviously. The other reason it's not going to happen is because our electoral rules. The single-member district, Senate, House, Electoral College, with plurality victories being sufficient in all but a few states. You don't have to win a majority. All you do is get one more vote than anybody else, and you win. That kind of system almost inevitably leads to a two-party system. Makes it very hard for third parties to jump in. Even if you had a third-party candidate at the presidential level, we've had them. We had George Wallace in '64. We've had Ross Perot. We had Teddy Roosevelt back in 1912. Didn't last. Even if somebody did win, that person would still have to go construct a state-by-state third party, and that's very hard to do because of the electoral rules, because of the difficulty of getting on the ballot, because of the difficulty of raising money. So are we going to get a third party out of this? I don't think so. I would doubt it very much, despite everybody's hopes. And the last thing to worry about in this election is Donald Trump's claim that he would not respect the election results. Well, that's just talk. I don't think he's going to do anything. Maybe make his new TV network or whatever he's talking about. But that kind of idea, if you look at the polls, it's really scary. 45% of people who say they're going to vote for Trump say they don't believe that the votes will be counted fairly. And that number has been growing over the last 20 years. The increasing cynicism about elections. Now that could have a couple consequences, the most benign of which would be simply that people choose not to vote. The non-benign consequence is that it could simply undermine the legitimacy of the whole election process. And who knows what could happen. We've seen growing protests at political meetings this year, a lot more than ever, and that is scary. So, in the end, what's going to happen? That's pretty clear what's going to happen. Hillary is president, Democrats probably controlling the Senate by probably only one seat or two seats, Republicans controlling the House, gridlock for the next 4 years, at least the next 2 years, probably the next 4, not much changing, and frustration growing. So who's going to be the next Donald Trump? I don't know. Thank you. Questions?
What do you think about term limits?
Absolute disaster. Why? First of all, the average congressman, term limits, it's typically said 12 years, right? That's what everybody's talking about. 6 House terms, 2 Senate terms. The average member of the House and Senate already serves less than 12 years, on average, number one. Number two, we have a lot of experience in the states. And I just had the privilege 2 summers ago of reading the entire literature on term limits. About 30 books and I don't know how many articles. And these are the people studying various states that have term limits. We had 15 states that enacted term limits. 2 of them gave that up, one by law and one by a court ruling. So we got 13 states with term limits. People who study those things find out some interesting things. Number one, the legislature loses power to the executive. Number two, the legislators become more dependent on staff and on lobbyists and interest groups. Number three, young people rush in, or new people rush in, after being term limited, after their predecessor was term limited, and they offer lots of new bills, but the bills aren't new. It's the same stuff that's been offered 10 years ago. It's nothing new happens. We also, number four, that there's no difference in legislative output when you have term limits versus you don't have term limits in the states. So by and large, almost all the scholars who look at this realize term limits aren't going to kill you. It's not going to do a big damage, but it's not going to do what everybody thinks it's going to do. You're not going to have this influx of citizen legislators who come in with great, bold, fresh ideas. It just ain't going to happen. When a congressman is term limited, he's going to be replaced by a senior member of the state legislature from his state, in his district. So you're still going to have professional legislators. So that's why I think it's a bad idea. Boots.
Did you say anything about changing demographics and
Yeah, well, that's obviously built into this whole situation where the country's going. The demographics, the minority vote, the increased Latino presence, and their increased registration, obviously that's going to the Democratic Party. It isn't inevitable that it would, however. I think a sensible, careful, clever Republican candidate could pick up a lot of that vote. And I think could pick up a good portion of the black vote as well. I mean, if you go back and look at George Bush, even Mitt Romney picked up a chunk of the Latino vote. George Bush picked up a huge chunk of it, 35, 38%, something like that. That's easily possible. But when you got someone like Donald Trump heading the ticket, which is why you, at the congressional and Senate level, you see these people running in the total opposite direction of what Trump is saying. And I would not be surprised if you see the votes for a number of these senators have a much larger component of black and Latino support than you will see at the presidential level. But that's just built into the fabric of demography. And Republicans, of course, are going to have to do something. After 2012, they had a super special Republican committee that got together, issued this report, and they said, we've got to reach out to these groups. Well, we didn't. The other thing they said is we're going to change the primary system to get rid of the front loading, to get rid of winner take all. The idea being if you have a proportional system, more of the better candidates will last longer during the primary system, and hopefully you get a better candidate at the end. That doesn't automatically work. I mean, you think of presidential elections as kind of a crapshoot. You just never know what's going to happen, and you don't.
What are the reasons for having such a long election season for president? Why can't we have a model like Israel or Great?
They have parliamentary form of government.
Well, no, I understand that. But we live in an internet age. I mean, it seems crazy that we have to depend on this kind of retail politics where you have to be at every state. And,
yeah.
You know.
Well, there's a whole bunch of reforms out there that would change, or reform proposals. Basically, they all have problems. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party, national committees, have tried to shorten the season. In fact, the Republicans a couple of years ago said, March, April, May, that's it, boom. That's still 3 months, but it's better than 5 months, right? The trouble is the nominating process is a function of the parties, not the government, and the dates set for events in states are determined by the state legislature and the governor. And most states, you remember what happened in 2008 and again in 2012? Florida and Michigan wanted to leapfrog everybody else and come right after Iowa and New Hampshire. And the parties said, well, that breaks our rules. If you do that, we're not going to seat your delegates at the national convention. Yeah, go ahead and have your primary there, but it ain't going to mean anything. Well, eventually they caved and sat the delegates anyways. But then this year, Florida and Michigan sort of behaved themselves and moved back. But why do we have it that way? There's no good reason for it, except that Iowa insists on going first, New Hampshire insists on going second. And anytime any other state tries to move ahead of them, they just adjust and jump. Remember in 2008, Iowa's caucuses were on January 6th. And they were perfectly willing to move it forward a week to Christmas Eve, if they had to. Right? It's a matter of state pride. So it doesn't make any sense. There's no good reason for it at all. Some people will say, well, the longer the process, the more voters will become aware of the candidates and more informed. Well, that only works if you've got a lot of candidates at the end, not just two or one. Right. And there it is true that, I mean, if you look at the studies, you can see voters do learn about the candidates during the primary season, which is why a one-shot primary in the middle of March would probably be a disastrous idea, because you do want informed voters, but you don't necessarily get them.
So Donald Trump, as a result of these frustrations that occurred because of increasing frustrations with gridlock,
Yep.
then what do you think an alternative is?
Go read my book on political reform. It's all there. I've got all the answers you ever wanted. Now, what I would do with this system, I would just trash the whole nominating system completely. I'd go back to do it the way they did it in 1790. You get the senators of a party, the congressmen of a party, and the governors of that party, and you put them into a room and say, pick your best person. And the reason I would argue that is because the current process has zero peer review in it. We, the voters who don't know much about these candidates, have to pick one of them. I would rather have them picked by the people with whom they have to work and on whose cooperation they will have to depend in the future. Now that proposal of mine will get exactly one vote. People say, oh, it's undemocratic. Well, this isn't a democracy. This is a republic, right? And it was never designed to be a democracy. And everybody gets to vote at the end of the system anyways. The other alternative, my fallback position, would be to do what a lot of states do at the state legislative level. You have a state convention. They pick two candidates, and then there's a primary leader that picks from those two. Somehow we've got to get some peer review into the system. And somehow we've got to figure out a way to tie presidential candidates to congressional candidates. Right now there is no linkage whatsoever, except sort of a shared ideology, which can be set aside. So my system of going back to a peer review system of which is the way they do it in every parliamentary system in the world practically. You pick your prime minister and your head of the opposition. Who picks them? It's usually the members of parliament from that party who do it, because they know these people.
So, do I understand correctly from what you're saying, if we were to take your advice and join with your one vote, then the Trump situation would not?
No, Donald Trump would not have gotten past home plate, let alone first base.
Because he has no peers.
Right. The people who probably would have passed muster would have been John Kasich and Bush. Jeb Bush probably would have been the top two. And maybe you'd had better candidates in. We all saw John Huntsman a week ago at the law school. He's a really good guy. The thing is, the politicians know who is good and who's not. And if you tie the future success of a congressman or a senator or a governor to picking the right president, that ties the president to those people, and you have the possibility of cooperation. Now, the other problem in our system, of course, is we've got the House, the Senate, and the President, and they're not all controlled by the same party. If they're all controlled by the same party, even there you don't get everything, because you have to have 60 members in the Senate to get past the filibuster. So if the knowledgeable participants were to pick their leaders, they would probably pick people who could work across the aisle, at least to some degree. That would get us out of the gridlock situation, which I'm afraid we're stuck in for as far as the eye can see.
I know in some primaries independents are allowed to vote. Has that, in those primaries, caused any shift?
That's an interesting question. The research on this is very mixed. The assumption would be if you let independents vote into what would otherwise be a closed primary, you would get more moderate results. Yeah, the evidence is really mixed on that. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. the totally open primaries, where you can have Democrats voting in the Republican primaries and vice versa, they don't produce any better results. In fact, I saw one study that shows that those kind of primaries actually produce more extreme results than closed primaries do. Now that's just one study among many, but so you get kind of a mixed result. There is really no right answer to that question, I don't think, which is why I don't like primaries. I think we should take the voters out of the primary system. Yeah,
Do you think
Harry.
that the fact that most people agree that Hillary's going to win the election
Yeah,
will suppress the vote of her?
yeah.
I mean, it seems too low.
That's usually what people argue. You know, it's hard to say for sure, because on the one hand, sometimes when you think your team is winning, you really get excited and you want to go out and make it win big. And that's what she's trying to do now, right? She wants to build up this landslide victory. That's why she's in Arizona and Texas and all over the place. Same thing on the Trump side. It could work either way. It could either say, oh, we're going to lose, I'm depressed, I'm not going to vote. Or it could say, gee, you know, this is America. This is where we support the underdogs. I'm going to go out and vote for my man. If you look at the historical record, there's no simple answer to that. It works, it cuts both ways. Mary?
Are you concerned about the current gridlock, which is leading to unconstitutional executive order governments, eventually leading
Yeah.
to something that looks like dictatorship?
Well, that's what I was saying, hinting at before, is that if the American public is so frustrated with Washington, and you get a president, and Obama's done a lot of this, but so did Bush. I mean, giving executive orders is not something Obama invented. This has been happening for 100 years. When presidents take more and more authority into their own hands, that certainly undermines the way our system is supposed to work. Now, I don't think we're going to have an Adolf Hitler or a Joseph Stalin or running around, but it is scary because it's very clear that, at least to me, that a lot of what Obama did and a lot of what Bush did is clearly unconstitutional. And their excuse is, well, it's like Abraham Lincoln. I got to save the Union. And what he did was unconstitutional. So, yeah, it scares me. It really does.
How about those voters, I see a lot of millennials in my family, it's down to the presidential election, make my vote count, send a message and vote for Johnson or somebody like that?
Yeah, typically third-party candidates fade as you get to the last week or two before the election. That happens almost all the time. It's going to happen again this time. Yeah, right. And Jill Stein's 1.1, 1.2. I tried to send a message once in an election. This was back when I was living in Wisconsin. Gaylord Nelson was this wonderful liberal Democratic senator. I supported him all my life. He's a great guy. But we all thought that his head's getting a little bit too big and he's getting a little too confident in himself. We got to scare him a little bit. So a bunch of us went and voted for Bob Kasten. The only problem was Bob Kasten won. So you got to be careful about sending a message. It's scary. Yeah.
The thing that bothers me about the map that you showed is that there is absolutely no incentive to cooperate. I mean, between the Republicans and the Democrats. They're like
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the job of the Congress is to legislate for the common good of the United States.
It
There's
is.
no incentive to do that.
No,
So then the president is
Yeah.
left. The president's job is to execute government, right?
Execute the laws.
Well, execute the laws or
Yeah.
to
Yeah, when there are no laws, you're in trouble, right?
right.
No, you're absolutely right. There's very little incentive.
So the culture, I guess a deeper comment or observation is that when you had the kind of back in the 70s, when you had that kind of mixture of viewpoints within both parties,
Yep,
you could forge cooperative relationships to get stuff done.
absolutely.
But and there were incentives to do that.
Well,
Right?
that
I mean, it was the structure was it was such that it incentivized cooperation.
it did, and it was
Whereas
built
now,
internally.
It,
Yeah.
it doesn't because the primaries are driven by the extremists. So
Yeah.
they will not reward compromise.
Sure. The problem we have with Congress is Congressmen represent their constituents too well.
Right.
And because the people who elect them are, either in general, diehard Republicans, diehard Democrats. And there is no incentive for someone to put that at risk. So you've got a problem. So we changed the electoral system. Some people have said, well, you know, why don't we do this? Why don't we follow California or Louisiana or Washington and have jungle primaries, where all the candidates of any and all parties pile into the same primary and you take the top 2 finishers and run them off. It's an idea, and 3 states do that now. We do not yet know what that means in terms of results. You get some strange results where you'll typically, in California this time, or last year, we had six congressional districts where you had 2 Democrats running or 2 Republicans running. Or you had another, I think the California was the 13th or 33rd district, something like that, heavily Latino district. You would absolutely bet your family's future on the fact that a Latino is going to win that election. Well, there were 6 Latino candidates and 2 white candidates. 6 Latinos chopped each other up, split the vote, and it was the 2 white, one extreme liberal Democrat, one very conservative Republican, who wound up running it off. So, you know, that can happen. There is a little bit of evidence that when you use that jungle primary system, you might get more moderate candidates emerging. There's conflicting evidence on that, but you can certainly make a logical case that that would happen. Because it would force all the candidates to look to those middle-of-the-road voters, because that's where you get your support. Unless there's a lot of candidates in the middle, in which case you want to just opt for the extreme groups and get yourself elected.
Why do you think all talk radio is conservative and all comedians
Are liberal.
I mean, is there a dynamic there that
Yeah,
explains that?
well, you know, a bunch of
It's
liberals.
uniform.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. I don't know. I know that liberals have tried creating talk radio stations, and they've failed, every single one of them. Now, maybe it's because liberals watch television instead of listen to the radio. I don't know. But you're right, it's a phenomenon. I think it's because angry people will support those kind of programs more, and I think more of the conservative types are angry than are the liberals. But that's just speculation. But it's an interesting phenomenon. So anyways, we got an interesting mess ahead of us in 8 more days. Do go out and vote responsibly. I've decided what I'm going to do. 13 days, is that what it is? Yeah, it's the 8th. It's the last possible day on which an election can be held. You know, the Tuesday after the first Monday. And on the 9th, what?
Don't vote often.
Don't vote. Well, you know what they say in Chicago, vote early and vote often, right? I once had a student when I was at Marquette, I shouldn't say this with students present, came in, I said, did you vote? Yeah, 3 times. How'd you do that? Well, I'm a resident of Massachusetts, and I voted absentee in Massachusetts. And in Wisconsin, to vote back then, all you had to do is show that you are a resident. And the way you did that is show your electric bill or your heating bill. So kids were living in an apartment. And so I showed them my electric bill. Then I went to the next precinct, because last semester I lived in that precinct, and I went over there and I showed them that electric bill. I voted 3 times. And people who say there's no voting fraud are nuts, because it happens. There's little evidence of it because there are no laws that allow the investigation of it. There's very little on site, that's true. There's probably a lot more of it, still a small amount, but more of it in mail-in ballots and things like that. You know, Pew, the Pew people did a study a couple years ago, and they found, how many was it? Several million people across the country who were registered who didn't exist. They were dead or had moved, left the country. North Carolina did an interesting study. There is a consortium, by the way, of 27 states where they share their registration lists with each other. And so North Carolina, this is about 3 or 4 years ago, went and looked at that, and they found, I can't remember the number, was it 729 or 279, I don't know. You know, a number of people, 400, whatever it was, who had the same last 4 digits of the Social Security number and same identical name, and they were registered in 2 different states to vote. Now, did they vote? Probably not. But it just tells us a little bit about the problem with our registration system. It's a mess. And then you want to try to purge the lists of people who you think are dead or whatever. then you wind up over-purging, as happened in Florida a couple years ago. So it is a real mess. And voter fraud, I'm actually more worried about voting machine errors and things of that sort. Administrators. You heard the story the other day. A woman who had lost both of her hands came in to register, or to actually vote, early voting in one of the states. And the rule is you have to sign your name to vote. She couldn't sign her name because she doesn't have any hands. And the voting administrator says, "I'm sorry, you can't vote." Which would be, taking a logical requirement to a super ridiculous extreme. And that is a problem because the local administrators of elections have tremendous discretion over challenging voters or not challenging voters. And that in turn allows for other folks to come in and work the intimidation factor. And I can tell you stories about that too. So the electoral system is a mess. It's a problem. And the solution obviously is, well, let's just have a national electoral base. And the Russians will be licking their chops at that, right? They're going to hack in, their boots will stop them. But
it's a challenge system, but it's a better system than any other one.
It's not a bad system. I'm definitely afraid of electronic voting. Some of you, I told the story to, Washington, D.C. was going to use electronic voting for local elections. And they got the system all set up. They hired these hotshot computer people. All done. They said, all right, we're going to do one more final check. We're going to see if anybody can hack into this. No, you can't possibly do that. So they sent emails out to, 10 or 12 university computing departments on Friday. They came back in the office Monday. They called up the stuff on the screen, and there was the University of Michigan fight song. They had completely hacked the election system totally. Yes?
Yeah, can we go back to your book for a second?
Sure.
I haven't read yet, but I now understand it. I absolutely.
Oh yeah, got to read it. It's great. It's cheap too.
I'm wondering, I've probably received this question a million times, but I need to ask.
Yeah.
So in your scenario, which is intriguing to me, what stake do voters have if, given as you pointed out, congressmen in general too well represent those who elect them? In your scenario, once they get into office, the incentives for them are to moderate and navigate a situation where they're going to be peer reviewed for consideration further down the line.
Right.
Right? So in that scenario, they're not representing their voters anymore, which means that if this worked right, you would actually have a huge investment of voters in the congressional election. You don't have right now because that's how they have it set in the presidential. But if you know that your congressman is going to get moderated or normalized through that process, why not just do this?
Well, I think what would happen is the voter would realize that you're not losing the congressman totally. You're simply creating a situation where there is a somewhat greater willingness to come together and compromise on issues. Again, this is the problem with democracy. It's very messy. It's not clean. And we as Americans have been sort of taught to expect everything's supposed to work just neat, clean. If you're a congressman, who do you represent? Do you represent all your constituents? If so, how do you do that? Do you represent the majority of your constituents who are of your party? Do you represent the constituents who voted for you? Do you represent the constituents who supported you during the election? Which voters? The one who voted for you in the general election or the one who's voted for you in the primary election? You got lots of choices of whom to represent. Right? And so what most of them do is they will represent the district's interests if those interests are clear, which they aren't always clear. They will figure out whether the constituency has a passionate interest in this issue, which is pretty rare. And if the constituency isn't interested, then the congressmen believe they're free to do what they want. But then on top of that, you have all these party pressures. Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid don't want you wandering off the reservation because they're afraid that if you do, you could get primaried, and if you get primaried, then you could lose the general election, and then they could lose majority control. And what this is all about is controlling the House and the Senate. It's not about governing. And that's a tragedy. That's why I think we need to fix the system. We're going to undemocratize to a degree. But that ain't going to happen.
Slightly But I guess I'm not sure that there's any democracy left in that system because I'm not sure.
Well, you vote for the congressman, then you vote for the president. Sure, there's lots of democracy there. It's just a question of who nominates the president is what I'm concerned about. I guess I'd be kind of concerned about who nominates the congressman too, but that's another issue. Mary?
I notice you haven't mentioned the media.
For all the right reasons. Yeah, the problem with the primary system for nominating is it enhances the power of the media tremendously. They set the bar as to who's going to win. Remember 1968? The media says Lyndon Johnson is going to romp and win big in the New Hampshire primary. He had to run for re-election. Gene McCarthy challenged him. Johnson beat McCarthy by 4 percentage points. All the headline says, McCarthy pulled stunning upset. That changed everything, drove Johnson out of the office. Right? So the media plays that tremendous role. And then, of course, the media focuses on the horse race, not the substance. The other problem is money. Money matters a huge amount. And that money's got to be raised usually before January if you want a shot at Iowa and New Hampshire. You got to be in Iowa and New Hampshire to organize, have your people on the ground, do the grassroots politicking. If you haven't done that 6 to 8 months in advance, you don't have a chance. Unless you're Donald Trump. And the media made Donald Trump. He got more free media coverage than all the other candidates together got paid coverage. You know, was it $2 billion worth of free media? And that tells us something about the media in America. It's all about building audiences so you can generate revenue. We do not expect the media to be our friends. At least I don't. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much.